Good morning, folks. I'm very happy to talk to you all today about the theory of constraints, or TOC for short. Before I discuss this topic, let me give you a little bit of information about my background. I am an engineer by training, and I've had a lot of experience in the automobile manufacturing industry in India before I moved into academia. I came to the US over 40 years ago to do my PhD in industrial engineering at Northwestern University in Illinois, and have since taught at the University of Michigan and more recently at the University of Tennessee since 1992. And I've taught and consulted on TOC for the past 30 years. Now, most of you are probably quite familiar with the term TOC, and some of you might have even been involved in some TOC projects. Now, very likely you have all probably read or at least heard of The Goal, a book on TOC written by Ellie Goldratt. Just for your information, do you know how many copies this book has sold? Over 6 million copies. Heck, that's a lot more copies than the first edition of the Harry Potter book, The Sorcerer's Stone, ever sold. Think about that. Well, TOC is based on the notion that the goal of a business is to grow in a sustainable and stable manner. But the extent to which such growth occurs is limited by the system's constraint. Note the parenthetical S added to the word constraint, like it is almost an afterthought. That is deliberate because at any point in time, TOC urges you to focus on the one core problem that is preventing the organization from its goal. Focus, the one magic word that captures what TOC is all about. How do you focus your efforts? TOC is based on big picture thinking, in which the focus is on the system rather than on its components, in which you focus on the possibilities rather than the limitations. Talking of possibilities, here's one. In 2004, Ellie Goldratt introduced the viable vision, which was to make the current revenue of an organization equal to its net profits in 4 years. Now, while the mission of the US Air Force is not to generate profits, the thought process and the methodology developed for enabling the viable vision is very relevant for you folks. I'll simply note at this stage that increasing revenues in a for-profit company is equivalent to bringing in new workload for the military. So let's discuss what is involved. At first glance, trying to make an organization's revenue equal to its net profits in 4 years appears to be quite an audacious vision, does it not? Most organizations would say this is not possible and they would walk away. And they would be right. As Henry Ford once said, if you think you can, you can. If you think you cannot, you're right. That is, you'll never be able to do it. One important point to note here, folks, is that if you want to achieve the viable vision, you can never get there by focusing on cost reductions, what I call a cost world mindset. You have to focus on growth, or a throughput world mindset. More on the throughput world mindset and how it applies to your world a little later. But first, here are the tools, the various areas where TOC finds application. In production, we have the drum buffer rope, a method to control production and improve throughput. This technique is discussed in the goal. Another application in finance, a technique called throughput accounting, is also discussed in the goal. Then there is a technique called CCPM, or critical chain project management, which is the TOC solution for project management that many of you would have probably heard of. We will not discuss these three applications in my talk. I'll simply note here that the drum buffer rope and critical chain project management techniques are especially relevant for the folks in the aircraft maintenance depots. And we at the University of Tennessee have done a lot of work with the Air Force depots to implement these tools and achieved remarkable successes. But since this is a conference for logistics officers, I will instead spend time on the next two topics: the TOC solution for distribution and replenishment, and a powerful suite of analytical tools, collectively referred to as the thinking processes. So you see, TOC has multiple applications, but in every instance, whether it is a TOC application in operations, in finance, in project management, or in supply chain management, you will soon see that there is one central theme for TOC, and that is focus. A focus on the one thing that is preventing you from achieving the goal, the core problem the organization needs to address. That, folks, is what we refer to as the constraint. Let's talk about this constraint first before we get into more detail on the TOC applications and tools. The constraint manifests itself in different ways in different organizations. It can either be a market constraint, a physical constraint, or a constraint caused by some policy or set of policies. Let's first look at the market constraint. Demand for the company's products and services is less than the capacity of the organization, or it is not in the desired proportion. You see, until sometime in the 1970s, and this is especially true in the automobile industry I worked in, we lived in a production-centric world. It was a world where demand usually outstripped capacity. Now, we are in a consumer-centric world where there is a lot of capacity, especially if you have a global footprint. And in some industries, such as the oil and natural gas industry, we even have to deal with a shrinking demand. Now, how can you achieve a viable vision if there is a market constraint? Well, one way is to find new markets, but that can pose challenges. Another option is to grow market share simply by stealing it from your competition. Is that even possible? And if so, how? So to gain market share, you have to present the customer with what Ellie Goldratt called as a mafia offer, an offer so compelling that the customer will find it very hard to turn it down. How would you present that offer? Well, it depends on the type of customer. I'll give you one example of a very well-known company that provided a very compelling offer to its customers before I talk about how TOC applies the mafia offer concept. And given my manufacturing background, this example is a very well-known automobile manufacturing company that flourished in the early part of the 20th century. A company that did great for a long time, but which started to flounder when it took its eye off the ball. You probably guessed the name of this company by now. It is the Ford Motor Company, which was able to achieve something like the viable vision. You know, the mafia offer Henry Ford made to the customer, it was simply a very low cost. And he was able to do that by evolving from the craft method of production to a very efficient mass production mode of operation. Did you know that in 1915, the typical sticker price for a car was $2,000? By contrast, 10 years later, in 1925, Ford's Model T cost only $260, about a tenth of that price. Henry Ford was thus able to gain a tremendous market share, often putting out of business other existing auto manufacturers that were producing cars using craft production methods. But although Ford was able to reach the common man with this mafia offer, something happened along the way. What is the quote you all associate with Henry Ford? Right, he said the customer can have any color so long as it is black, did he not? Now, why do you think he painted the car that color? It was because he was fixated on throughput velocity. And Japan black paint, as it was called those days, was the paint that dried the fastest, which allowed him to produce cars faster and sell it faster. Talking of fast, do you know how long it took the Ford Motor Company to convert raw material iron ore dug up from the Mesabi Range in Minnesota to the time this iron ore ended up in a finished automobile from the River Rouge plant in Michigan? Think about it this way. The iron had to be loaded into a freight car, transported all the way to the River Rouge plant, many miles away, melted down in a blast furnace, converted to sheet metal. That goes then into a press shop where it is stamped and then it's painted and then it's moved to the final assembly line. How much time do you think that took, the whole process? It was 81 hours. Wasn't that phenomenal? But in his quest for throughput velocity, Ford unfortunately lost sight of his customers who were getting a little tired of the standard black Model T. That let other auto manufacturers like General Motors steal his market share simply by offering customers more variety. Incidentally, that created a lot more inventory in the supply chain compared to Henry Ford's lean operations. But had it not been for World War II, which created a big demand for the Ford chassis, Ford Motor Company might have gone bankrupt. To Ford's credit, though, he created a lean operational model that is still being emulated in a variety of ways. You folks probably know that the Toyota production system was inspired by Ford's famous moving assembly line, but many other industries have also used many of his other innovative ideas. Incidentally, Ford's influence went beyond the manufacturing arena, even into entertainment. Did you folks know that he inspired the well known rock group, the Rolling Stones? They stole his thought process to come up with lyrics and song titles for many of their well known hits. For example, when Ford's Model T had a huge market share and a near captive customer base, unhappy customers would come to Henry Ford and say, "I can get no satisfaction." To which Henry Ford would say, "You can't always get what you want. I've got you under my thumb, so please don't start me up because time is on my side." Yes, it is. I'm just going to paint it black. I could go on, but let's not digress anymore. Let's instead talk about how TOC applies the mafia offer. And I'm first going to take the B2B retail sector. A mafia offer the manufacturer of retail products could make to its customer, which would be a retail store. It would be a guarantee that it'll always keep the customer's shelf stocked, especially the fast moving products, which presents lots of challenges, by the way. This is the make to availability promise, a unique TOC concept used in the TOC solution for distribution and replenishment. The make to availability, or the MTA promise, goes beyond the notion of make to order or make to stock, in that it guarantees the customer that the manufacturer will always keep the customer's shelf stocked with its products, failing which the manufacturer will pay the customer a hefty penalty. How is that for a mafia offer? And how about coupling this guarantee with another that offers to take back any unsold goods? Such an approach was used by Godrej Group in India, a $4 billion organization operating in sectors as diverse as real estate, consumer products, appliances, furniture, security, and agricultural products. In 2004, the Consumer Products Division of Godrej applied this TOC solution to achieve the viable vision. And in 2015, it received the first Platinum Award from the TOC International Certification Organization for its ability to sustain this viable vision implementation all these years. Now, let's talk about how this mafia offer concept can apply in your world. Let's take the example of Standard Aero. You folks know this company. They're presenting in your symposium. This is an organization that we have a branch in the Knoxville area, and this branch used to repair and overhaul jet engines at one time with a standard turnaround time of 15 days. This was in a world where the standard turnaround time for the other organizations was 45 days. 15 days. If you consider the cost of a jet engine and how the absence of one could result in an aircraft on ground, an aircraft that is unable to fly, then you see the value of this mafia offer and how this organization could even charge the customer a premium price. Incidentally, do you know how much a commercial airliner evaluates the cost of an aircraft on ground? As much as $50,000 per aircraft per day. So think about how much benefit a 30-day reduction in engine repair and turnaround time would be to the customer. The Tech Ops Center for Delta Airlines in Atlanta, whom we have worked with quite a bit, provides a similar mafia offer to its customers, focusing on lead time reduction across all its operations. So far we have only considered market constraints. Let's talk about other types of constraints, for example, physical constraints. As I told you earlier, until the 1970s, we were in a production-centric world where there was a lack of capacity. Now we are in a globalized consumer-centric world where everyone is competing for a better share of the market. That implicitly points out that there is more than enough capacity in the market. So we have a seeming paradox, don't we? Is it possible to have a lack of capacity in a world where there is plenty of capacity? Now, it's certainly possible that your organization has to deal with some physical constraints that prevent it from achieving the goal. And often people point to poor supply chain management, complaining that material shortages prevent them from delivering a product. That may well be the case, but have you ever considered that such so-called physical constraints could stem from policies in your organization that create artificial physical constraints? Therein lies the rub. So much so that I have an entire slide dedicated next to these types of constraints, policy constraints. Please note that the term policy constraint is grammatically incorrect. The correct phrasing should be constraints caused by policies. Heck, that is too wordy for me. I'll just refer to them as policy constraints. So these are the entire system of measures, methods, and mindset that govern the strategic and tactical decisions of the company. It's that important. So let's see what they are. A mindset constraint arises when people in the organization resist implementation of any new methods or metrics for a variety of reasons. I give such resistors a label. I simply address them as the Trinity. What is this Trinity? Well, the typical Trinity character is somebody who responds to any suggestions for improvement with the following Trinity. You don't understand. We are different. That won't work here. I bet you have Trinities in your organization. Coupled with that, we also have something called a methods constraint. And a methods constraint arises when you use procedures or techniques that produce actions which are not compatible with your goals. I'll give you a tongue-in-cheek video talking about a methods constraint, and then we'll discuss it.
A group of scientists placed 5 monkeys in a cage and in the middle a ladder with bananas on top. Every time a monkey went up the ladder, the scientists soaked the rest of the monkeys with cold water. After a while, every time a monkey went up the ladder, the others beat up the one on the ladder. After some time, no monkey dare go up the ladder, regardless of the temptation. Scientists then decided to substitute one of the monkeys. The first thing this new monkey did was go up the ladder. Immediately, the other monkeys beat him up. After several beatings, the new member learned not to climb the ladder, even though he never knew why. A second monkey was substituted, and the same occurred. The first monkey participated on the beating for the second monkey. The replacements repeated until what was left was a group of 5 monkeys that, even though never received a cold shower, continued to beat up any monkey who attempted to climb the ladder. If you asked the new group of monkeys why the beatings took place, the answer would probably be,
"Well, I don't know. That's just how things are done around here."
So you see, a methods constraint can exist when people resist change of any kind whatsoever, just like the Trinity. Finally, there are constraints caused by metrics. We all know metrics drive behavior. Tell me how you'll measure me and I'll tell you how I'll behave. If you measure me in an irrational way, do not complain about irrational behavior. So improperly chosen metrics can cause a lot of dysfunctional behavior. So how can we address policy constraints? Let me ask you this question. If you ask anyone in your company how many problems he or she is facing, what do you think the answer would be? In all likelihood, this person will roll their eyes and say, "Don't ask me how many problems I'm dealing with, just too many to count." Therein lies the rub. You are aware that many things need to change, and that if you do nothing, it'll lead to stagnation or decline. But you also know that change is not easy. And you're wondering where to begin because you clearly do not want to change too many things all at once. So, where is the most pressing constraint? What we call the core problem. To better understand how TOC addresses this question, let's talk about the underlying philosophy. To sharpen focus needed to realize the goal, Goldratt made the following statement in the preface to the goal, where he talked about how practically anyone can be a scientist. He wanted to tell us that we can all be outstanding scientists, but to be one, you did not need a lot of brain power, just the ability to look at things logically and precisely and to be able to improve it. The point is that you need to constantly analyze and challenge basic assumptions about status quo. In other words, you need the ability to see things in a new light so that you can truly say, "I can see clearly now. I can see all the obstacles in my way." Doesn't that sound like a familiar tune in your head? To that end, there are four obstacles you must overcome. The perception of reality as complex, accepting conflicts as given, our tendency to blame others, and above all, thinking that we know. The approach used to overcome these four obstacles embodies the TOC mindset, and they are referred to as the four pillars of TOC. So, what are these four pillars? Well, they are the polar opposites of these perceived obstacles. The first is the notion of inherent simplicity. When you think about it, once you understand a problem well enough, the solution to it becomes almost embarrassingly simple. The second obstacle is our tendency to accept conflicts as given. So we live our lives accepting and dealing with compromises. Compromises are perceived as something we have to live with. Well, the TOC community does not accept conflicts as given. Instead, we try to better understand the legitimate needs on both sides of the conflict and try to remove any harmful conflict as soon as it appears. This is increasingly becoming a standard attitude within the TOC community. The third obstacle to thinking clearly is our tendency to blame others. How often have you said, "That guy is a troublemaker. He will never accept the proposition because he's a Trinity and he'll find a problem with it"? Instead of saying that and blaming others, how about you instead ask, "This is what he said is the problem. How can I overcome the problem?" In other words, don't blame others. And that brings us to the fourth obstacle. Whenever you think you know the answer, we stop learning. That blocks the ability to forge ahead because every situation can be substantially improved. That creates a huge dichotomy, especially when your subordinate comes to you and says, "Hey, please provide me some direction." How can you say you don't know? So instead, how about a more collaborative approach to finding a new direction? One where you simply say, "This is what I think we should do," but where you also say, "Let's talk about it," and invite suggestions from your people. These four pillars, which provide the foundation for the TOC philosophy, results in a powerful suite of analytic tools called the thinking processes. Before we talk about these thinking processes, here is an exercise to tease out the first pillar, the notion of inherent simplicity. I came across this exercise while I was creating my slides on the four pillars sometime in 2015. And it's a set of four questions, the first two of which are very easy. Look at question one. Divide the white area in square A into two equal pieces. You got the answer to it even as you read the question, right? Now for question two, divide the white area in square B into three equal pieces. You probably took at most a split second to answer it, right? Question three is a little harder. So I'm going to give you some time to solve it. But before you do that, Note first that a seemingly obvious answer, I'm going to stop you from going that way. The seemingly obvious answer is to draw four triangles as follows. This is an incorrect answer because the two lower triangles identified with circles, they are larger than the two upper triangles identified with those squares, are they not? The lower two are obviously bigger. So here's how I approach the problem, and I'm not suggesting you use the same approach, but I followed a pattern. I noticed that for question one, you kept the whole side of each square intact. For question two, I divided each side, or I noticed each side was divided into two equal segments, like so. So what I did for question three was I divided each side into four equal segments as follows. And the moment I did that, the answer jumped out at me, and I was able to answer it in 15 seconds. But I'm going to give you a minute or so to answer this question. And while you're answering it, I'll look in the chat box to see if you have any questions for me. So I'm going to give you a minute. Here's the answer. Now, let me ask you the following question. Why was this answer not obvious? And should it have been obvious in the first place? Let me show you why it should have been obvious. The answer is staring you right there in the face. To make it even more obvious, let me do a little reshading of this graph. There you have it. Well, let me tell you, I got the answer to question three almost immediately. But when I got to the next question, I was stumped. This question said, divide the white area in square D into 5 equal pieces. So I went with the same process. I divided each side into 5 equal segments, but that didn't work. So I tried other approaches like drawing circles, and that got me wrapped around in circles. And I continued my efforts for 4 minutes before I gave up and asked my daughter who was visiting us at that time, I asked her for help. She took one glance at it and said, Daddy, why are you so slow? The answer is obvious. I said, tell me, Madhu. And she said, it's simple. You just draw 4 lines as follows. And I said, oh, that's brilliant, Madhu. How did you get it so quickly? She said, I've been playing Tetris ever since I was a little kid, and the answer was obvious. I said, we assume that things are complicated and we get trapped in the ghosts of our thoughts. We carry on the same syndrome to our relationships too and make them complicated. If you think a situation is complex, then you will find that it is. That is why Goldratt would often say, complex problems do not need complex solutions. The more complex the problem, the simpler the solution must be. Because a seemingly complex problem asks you to analyze it a little more carefully with a fresh perspective, which brings out its inherent simplicity. As I told you before, once you understand a problem well enough, the solution to it becomes almost embarrassingly simple. And this is where the TOC thinking processes come in. This is a suite of tools that use cause-effect analysis to analyze seemingly complex problems, surface the core problem, and resolve the conflicts created by it. You see, all systems operate in a cause-effect environment. And the fact that a situation exists almost inevitably means that something else is causing that system to exist. Nearly all the problems you observe are just indicators of some underlying cause or causes. And it doesn't make sense to treat that problem head on. That's like applying a band aid to an infected wound. You need to identify the critical root cause of all these problems. And that brings me to one important tool in the suite of the thinking processes. It's called the current reality tree, or CRT. The CRT is used to surface the core problem, the cause of the core conflict. And the key is to accept that core conflict as a base for understanding, not something to be afraid of, because now you have the key to solve something really significant. Now, how many of you have heard of the term the 5 whys? This is a form of root cause analysis, is it not? So basically, the idea is to ask why repeatedly until you either drill down to identify the root cause or you simply give up and say, hey, go ask your mother. And if you had attended any lean training where the instructor taught you the 5 whys, you would almost surely have heard of the example on why the Lincoln Memorial was deteriorating. You see, this marble and limestone monument was deteriorating and showing significant signs of wear. So the engineers analyzing the situation asked why this was happening. You know what they found? They found it was because harsh chemicals were being used to clean it. So they said, why are we using these harsh chemicals? And they found that the primary reason was that there were a large number of birds flying around the monument, leaving their droppings behind. If you had stopped the analysis at this stage, what would you have done? Kill all the birds? The next why revealed that they were flying around to catch spiders that had built webs there. Again, if you had stopped probing right there, you would have probably blanketed the monument with spider juice. But a further why indicated that the spiders had built their webs to catch the insects flying around the monument, the gnats and the midges and so on. So if you had stopped probing at this stage, you would have surely blanketed the monument with pesticide, right? But when they asked why there were so many insects flying around, what do you think was the answer? It was the lights shining on the monument. That led to the solution. Do not turn on the lights before dusk because it will attract all these insects to the monument. And also turn off the lights at 10 p.m. After all, who in their right mind would wake up their spouse at 2 a.m. and say, honey, let's visit the Lincoln Memorial. It is romantic at this time of the night. So you see that the deterioration of the Lincoln Memorial was actually caused by the lights illuminating it. Who would have thought that was the reason? That is the power of root cause analysis. So the 5 why technique is seemingly, emphasis on the word seemingly, such an effective method. If so, why is it not used more widely? It is because drilling down to the root cause does not always proceed in such a simple linear fashion. It doesn't go straight from there in one path. There could be many paths the analysis could take. For example, look at the large number of birds flying around. Why could that be? It could be maybe there are many visitors feeding the birds. Or the Lincoln Memorial deteriorating could be because it was just built faultily. And so on. There are so many possibilities and so many branches that this analysis could take that often people give up on this technique. They say, just too difficult. But Elie Goldratt was a physicist by training, and he was a great admirer of Isaac Newton, who had once postulated that all problems in this world were caused by one root cause. Newton was, of course, speaking metaphorically, but Goldratt was inspired to apply that idea to business problems. And he noticed that while the causes started to branch out, eventually they converged to a very few core problems. So here's the basic idea. Have problems everywhere. How can we even start? Well, What if they all converged to a common cause? This is precisely what Goldratt noticed was the case. So he called this the current reality tree, because if all these problems converge to one or two common causes, then it's best to spend your limited efforts right there. He called this technique the current reality tree. And the best way for you to think about the current reality tree is to think of it as the 5 whys on steroids. So let me tell you how I applied this technique in one of my consulting gigs. So a few years ago, I did a project for a medium-sized manufacturing company that was experiencing declining markets and revenues. This organization, identified as the factory in the slide, had to deal with a whole host of problems. It also identified these problems along with problems one of its key customers was facing. So here they are. And as you will see in the slide, these are classic problems present in many supply chains. See, for example, how the manufacturer had a problem with large inventories, yet it also had to deal with stockouts. Meanwhile, its customer was also having the same issues, large inventories on the one hand and stockouts on the other. So the company was at a loss how to proceed. But if you buy into this Newtonian concept of convergence, you will seek connection between all these problems because they all must be related. And what we're going to do here in this technique is we are going to draw an arrow from the cause to the effect. For example, the factory is unable to estimate customer demand because it is hit by infrequent customer orders. So you draw an arrow from the infrequent orders from customer to the box which says factory is unable to estimate customer demand. And likewise, the factory is under pressure to cut costs because it is experiencing declining markets and revenues. So draw an arrow from experiencing declining markets and revenues to under pressure to cut costs. What you're going to say is, if the factory is experiencing declining markets and revenues, then the factory is under pressure to cut costs. So if we proceed in this manner, here is what we found. Most of the problems in the supply chain could be explained by other causes. And these causes in turn were probably intermediate causes that led to still other causes. And drilling down in this manner, we found 4 problems that did not have an arrow leading up to them. What were they? Well, they were what we called possible core causes. Problems number 3, 9, 10, and 11, and I have circled them in this figure. You know, at this stage, the folks in the company were delighted. They said, wow, we have taken so many problems and crystallized it into just 4 possible causes. Let's start to work on them. But at this stage, I said, wait, folks, just a little. Just wait a little. I urged them to drill down a little deeper. I told them, you have to view things with an eagle eye so that they could take it to the limit one more time. Told them, you cannot afford to take it easy and have that peaceful, easy feeling. And I told them that if you want to live life in the fast lane, you cannot check out anytime you like. So we drilled down even further. I put them back to work. And when we drilled further, we noticed that there were actually 3 major problems. Some of them stemmed from these so-called core problems they identified. So look at these. These are the major problems. And what are they? Problem number 11, 16, and 18. We did not try to address problem 11, which said the customer is unable to estimate end user demand, because at this stage, that was outside our scope of control. But you'll see that we're able to get there too. But we're able to address the other 2. The problem caused by the PPV metric, the purchase price variance metric, which I'll explain next, and the customer's desire to use what we call a minimum order quantity or MOQ formula to place orders. That made orders come in at infrequent points in time. So we come back full circle. It turns out these policies were the result of a cost world mindset, and that produced a lot of dysfunctional behavior. Take, for example, the PPV or the purchase price variance metric. This is a procurement metric that aims at material cost reduction. Essentially, if a purchasing manager finds a cheaper source for an item, The PPV metric for that item becomes negative and she gets rewarded. How many of you recall the huge offshoring and outsourcing activity from the early 2000s that was primarily driven by this metric? How successful were those efforts? When you consider the hidden costs of offshoring, freight, additional inventory, that long pipeline, et cetera, from stuff coming from, say, China or India, just to show you have no bias here. And don't forget the intellectual property costs, the cost of lead time, the lack of flexibility, and so on. It becomes clear why these organizations are now rethinking the PPV metric and instead talking about the TCO, or the total cost of ownership metric. So at this stage, I urge the manufacturer, hey, please revisit the PPV metric and chant the Angus Young mantra. They looked at me and said, who the heck is this Angus Young? And don't give me any of that mantra crap. I had to patiently explain to them that this guy, Angus Young, is a person from a rock band, AC/DC, who said that if you want dirty deeds done dirt cheap, then you're on the highway to hell, and you should not get thunderstruck if that does not get you back in black. They eventually got the message. So similarly, we revisit the MOQ policy with the customer and let them know that they could continue to order commodity items using the MOQ policy. But for critical items, we explained how both parties, the manufacturer and the customer, would benefit if the customer placed orders periodically at regular points in time rather than waiting until their inventory fell below safety stock levels. The factory even provided an MTA promise for these critical items. And by serendipity, it gave both the factory and the customer better visibility on the actual end user demand. So even the customer was no longer surprised. We indirectly attacked that problem number 9 as well. So this brings us to a summary, so to speak. It talks about some takeaways. One of the takeaways is how important it is to focus in your quest to grow business. And that's what TOC does. It helps you focus the organization's efforts on the goal just by isolating the core problem. The second important takeaway I would like to leave you with is the difference between a cost world mindset and a throughput world mindset. And so,
yes, there are 2 paths you can go by, but in the long run, there's still time to change the road you're on.
So folks, we at the University of Tennessee offer a wide variety of programs in these areas and more. First of all, we have the Aerospace and Defense MBA program. This is a 1-year program with 5 residency periods. We also offer many short courses, a number of 2-day courses in TOC on the various tools that I talked to you about, including project management and DBR and so on. We also have a couple of 5-day programs. And we are on these programs in various places, like at Las Vegas, the Nellis Air Force Base, just recently at the RAF base in Mildenhall, England, just January. During the pandemic time, I did this online. And then we have these 1-week courses in Lean MRO or Lean TOC. And we have also a number of books that the Lean MRO faculty at UT have published. One is called Building Lean Supply Chains with the Theory of Constraints. It is one of 2 books that is referenced in the Art of the Possible handbook. And you're going to listen to Art of the Possible from Connie Davis shortly. And then we have the Lean MRO book. And if any of you folks are interested in any of our vast array of programs, please email either of these points of contact, Byron Reisner or James Cody. You have their email addresses right there, breisner@utk.edu, jcody@utk.edu. Thank you, folks. Good day.